Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Ask the Educator podcast. This is Kevin Anderson, your host, and with me, as usual, Adam Okada. And for this episode, we have a special external guest joining us today, Alex Hilliker from ChemDAQ. Alex, welcome to the show. And with that welcome, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin and Adam. First of all, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I love the podcast, and it means a lot to me and the team that you invited us on. My name's Alex Hilliker. I'm the executive vice president here at ChemDAQ Incorporated. We are a small business headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and our mission is to empower sterile processing departments to eliminate workplace exposure to toxic chemicals in their daily processes. And excited to talk about that a little bit today with y'all.
All right, sounds great. And so tell us a little bit, why is chemical safety going to be an important thing for our sterile processing audience to know about?
Yeah, Adam, it's funny. This is a topic that quite frankly just isn't talked about enough, right? Because the priority in sterile processing departments, of course, is patient safety, and it should be. That should be paramount. That's number one. But there's a lot of myths around chemical safety, right? And there's a lot of people that think that because of the advances in technology and chemistry over the last 20, 30 years, that there are very few risks in dealing with those chemicals on a daily basis. And so having a conversation about just real world things that people can do in their department to keep themselves and their team safe, which also by extension keeps the patient safe as well, right? So this is something that there's a lot that's been happening in the last couple of years related to chemical safety and SPDs. We'll talk about the update to AAMI ST58, I'm sure, in the next few minutes as well. And so really this is just a critical time to make sure people are aware of what they could possibly be exposed to in their daily work.
Well, I think it's great because there are a number of things, uh, both in the sterile processing space and the OR space where I used to come from, where we kind of get used to these environmental risks that we live in every single day, and you kind of forget that there are actual risks involved. So I think it's great to go over this stuff and hopefully bring another level of awareness to the sterile processing folks out there. So with that being said, you mentioned AAMI ST58. This is one of my gripes about us as sterile processing professionals. We don't know enough about the standards that we have. We have ST79, and most people seem to be familiar with that, but we have plenty more standards that really apply to the sterile processing industry, including ST58. So, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about ST58 and the changes Amy made to this document that impact sterile processing departments.
Yeah, so ST58, for those of your listeners that may not know, it's the AAMI standard for chemical sterilization and high-level disinfection in healthcare facilities. And it was updated at the end of last year in 2024. And relevant to this conversation, really for the first time, there's a great deal of emphasis on safety and use of the chemicals in sterilization and HLD, specifically hydrogen peroxide and parasitic acid. And so what Amy says, and really kind of for the first time, continuous vapor monitoring is recommended in ST58 because of a few reasons, right? Right. So first and foremost, they say that odor is an unreliable indicator of a safe workplace when we're talking about chemical vapor concentrations. The reason for that is pretty simple, right? Vaporized hydrogen peroxide has no odor until you get to a very high concentration and you're well past the permissible exposure limits. Parasitic acid, if you've worked around it, and I'm sure all of your listeners have, or most of your listeners have, when you worked around parasitic acid, it's a very pungent,
Yeah.
vinegar, acidic-like odor. The problem with that is our noses and our sense of smell is not reliable in the sense of what's safe or what's not. And so Amy says that because odor is an unreliable indicator, and because equipment can and sometimes does fail, that having continuous monitoring in place to keep your team safe is a best practice and is recommended. In talking about hydrogen peroxide, just for a second in particular as well, the specific language in the standard is that vapor monitoring is recommended if there is the potential for exceeding the OSHA permissible exposure limit of 1 part per million. And there's a number of studies out there that talk about the residual hydrogen peroxide in the chamber that an SPD team member could be exposed to when they open that door. And so we know that because odor is an unreliable indicator, because sometimes machines can and do fail, that continuous monitoring is something that SPD should really be taking a close look at.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in how chemical sterilization and high-level disinfection, because we talk about peracetic acid and all these things, how has that evolved over the years? And then today, what's going on in the departments today, and what safety considerations should departments be thinking about?
Yeah, it used to be, some of your listeners may be familiar with ethylene oxide. Ethylene oxide was the gold standard chemical sterilant in hospitals for decades. It was starting to really rise to prominence in the 1950s, 1960s. And the reason that ethylene oxide was such a great sterilant and quite frankly is such a great sterilant, it's still used to sterilize more than half of all medical devices in the United States today, is because it's a very effective penetrant. It can go really deep into the nooks and crannies of instrumentation to make sure that you achieve that level of sterilization. The problem with that is it's highly toxic, right? ETO is a known carcinogen for humans, and it takes a long time to come out of the product after sterilization. Some people might be surprised to learn that ETO sterilization cycles could take 8, 10, 12 hours, right? And Kevin, you may have been around that back in the day, right? And so
Well, we used it at my facility, so yeah, I'm familiar.
yeah, and so that off gassing, post sterilization, that posed a real risk to people working in the department. And so in the 90s, ASP actually came out with with the first hydrogen peroxide gas plasma sterilizer in the 90s. And then you started to see hydrogen peroxide really come to prominence because of the safety concerns with ETO, and then also cycle time, right? I mean, what used to take 8, 10, 12 hours back in the 80s and 90s, now we can do in 29 minutes, 28 minutes with a VHP cycle or a H2O2 gas plasma cycle. And so with that, really ETO is seldom used in hospitals today. There's still some out there for really specific instruments or R&D purposes, but I mean, by and large, it's really all H2O2, right? And then for high-level disinfection, very similar story. Glutaraldehyde was very common in the 60s. Cold soak, open bins, open air ventilation. Some of your younger listeners might be thinking that sounds like the Wild Wild West with ETO and glutaraldehyde. But systems like the Stera System 1, things like that came into play for parasitic acid, automated endoscopy processors, and glutaraldehyde, very similar to ETO, had some significant human health concerns. It's a sensitizer, which means that you can actually trigger prolonged exposure the more you're around it. And when you have a full contained system, like an automated endoscopy processor, you can also do that a lot faster. And generally speaking, it's a lot safer because the disinfectant is all included in the system. And so those, the most common chemicals that we use today, hydrogen peroxide for sterilization and parasitic acid for high-level disinfection, those really were sort of part of the evolution from ethylene oxide and glutaraldehyde, and have really upped the level of safety in departments, but still kind of have some hazards of their own, which we can certainly talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I love going back to the ethylene oxide and all that and how in the little bit of history there, how we got to where we are today. And what it kind of reminds me of is a lot of times how we sort of learn some of the risks and all that to us after the fact. It's like a lagging thing. It's like, yeah, we know the chemistries can be, harmful in a way, but we have this great machine that takes care of it or whatever. But eventually you end up finding out, well, it's not necessarily perfect.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you guys work on is, obviously making people aware of this. But there are things, and you had touched on it briefly, is an OSHA exposure limit or a permissible exposure limit. And that's a really important terminology and something that people need to be more aware of in their sterile processing department. So, can you kind of explain what a permissible exposure limit and why does it matter and how is it measured?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it to your point about the systems containing the chemicals themselves, I think it's important to remember, and I'll talk about PELs in a second, but it's important to remember that hydrogen peroxide is it's a biocide, right? It's a sterilant. It's designed to kill everything that it touches.
Yep.
And so even a tiny little leak or residual could potentially be harmful for us. And with parasitic acid as a high level disinfectant, also designed to kill the bad stuff. And so we want to make sure that we're minimizing the amount that we're breathing in. And to talk about OSHA permissible exposure limits, for OSHA decided to come out with permissible exposure limits, or PELs, which is essentially the legal limit that we as humans can be exposed to safely, sort of in quotes, right,
Mhm.
over a given period of time. And those are usually expressed in terms of a time weighted average, or TWA, you'll see. And if you look at your safety data sheets and things like that, this will be on there. There's a long-term exposure limit. That's about an 8 hour, or that's an 8 hour exposure limit. That's your permissible exposure limit that we're talking about. Typically put out there as an 8 hour time weighted average. There's also a short-term exposure limit, or STEL, some people will call it. That's your 15-minute time weighted average. So what can you
Okay.
safely be exposed to in a 15-minute period? Typically, of course, the 8 hour TWAs are smaller, and the 15-minute TWAs are a little bit higher.
Higher.
Um, and so, I think your listeners may be surprised to learn that the permissible exposure limit for ethylene oxide is 1 part per million. There's some work that EPA has been doing in recent years to actually bring that permissible exposure limit down. Um, Interestingly enough, the permissible exposure limit for hydrogen peroxide is 1 part per million. It's exactly the
The
same
same.
as ethylene oxide. In the conversations that I have, Kevin and Adam, and at trade shows and visiting our customers and things like that, I would say 80-90% of people don't know that. And it's because of what we talked about. It's because hydrogen peroxide is a sterilant. It's designed to kill things. Um, Hydrogen peroxide is also a known animal carcinogen with
Mhm.
unknown relevance to humans, and it's a mutagen. So this is stuff that we're that definitely there's some safety considerations that need to be made.
Yep.
And I think that I mentioned myths earlier. I think that when people think about hydrogen peroxide, they think about the brown bottle they buy at the pharmacy and put on cuts and scrapes. They think about, oh, hydrogen peroxide's in laundry detergent and toothpaste and shampoos and things like that. I joke sometimes that hydrogen peroxide has the world's best PR team because people think about it as a household item.
Yep.
It's in sprays and things like that. What people don't realize is that that's a 3% concentration of hydrogen peroxide. And what's inside that sterilizer that's being used in the SPD is anywhere from 55% to 95% concentration, which
Wow.
sometimes I make the analogy that's rocket fuel. If you look up how much hydrogen peroxide percentage is in rocket fuel, it's in that 80-90% range. And so when you think about that, it puts things in perspective of what's generally considered safe. And then the last thing I'll say, you'll have to stop me, Kevin. I get excited about this stuff, but
It's all good, man.
the permissible exposure limit of 1 part per million, that can be hard for people to visualize and
Sure.
understand. What does that mean? What is 1 part per million? An analogy that we've used in the past to kind of help people grasp that is think of a 5 gallon bucket that you can get at Lowe's or Home Depot or something like that. Um, then think of two of them filled all the way to the top. Uh, 1 part per million is one drop in those two 5 gallon buckets. So we're talking about a very, very small amount, is what OSHA says for hydrogen peroxide you're permitted to be exposed to of your 8 hour shift.
Oh,
Parasitic acid, it doesn't have an OSHA PAL, interestingly. Um,
wow.
Now, some people may say, oh, they're surprised to hear that. We know that OSHA can move slow on things. The government can move slow on things. The 1 part per million permissible exposure limit for hydrogen peroxide came out in the 1970s, and has not been updated since. There was another 20 years or so until the vaporized hydrogen peroxide started to be used in hospitals with the ASB system.
My
So
goodness.
for parasitic acid, there's no permissible exposure limit. There's no short-term exposure limit. But the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, ACGIH, has a threshold limit value, or TLV. You may see that term some places. And that's 0.4 parts per million over 15 minutes. So less than half of the PEL for hydrogen peroxide is the 15-minute threshold limit value for PAA. So, and again, that's from the ACGIH. Let's pause there. I could keep going, but let's pause there. Okay.
It's all
No,
good.
I think this is all great stuff to know. And it's interesting because we do work around these chemicals every day. So if
Mhm.
there's a listener out there who's thinking to themselves, I had no idea that the chemistries that we used could be toxic. I mean, if
Mhm.
they're exposed in
Yeah,
inappropriate amounts, they can be.
right.
What monitoring technologies are available for chemical exposure, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of those?
Yeah, Adam, what do we do about it? Right? So how do we know? We used to use this tagline at ChemDAQ all the time called "Are you safe? How do you know?" Right? And it was really about exactly what you're talking about, the monitoring component. Um, so there's various parts of a chemical monitoring program that people can adopt. I think one of the more common ones is badge monitoring. People will, if your manager has ever asked you to wear a little badge on your lapel throughout your shift, they're sending that badge to a lab to tell you what you were exposed to throughout the course of your shift to make sure that the department is compliant with those permissible exposure limits, and in some cases, those short-term exposure limits. That's great. We're a big fan of badge monitoring as a way to understand your environment generally. The downside of that is it's retroactive, right? So,
Yeah.
you're finding out after the fact what you were exposed to, as opposed to finding out in the moment and being able to actually take action and minimize that exposure or that chance of overexposure. Um, so, we always talk about the importance of that real time, instantaneous feedback. So there's also portable monitors that are out there, and people will have their industrial hygienist come up and take readings a couple of times a year. Again, great step in the right direction to understand, the vapor concentration in your department when you're running an AER cycle or a VHP cycle. Um, but again, what happens when you're not running that test, when you're not wearing the badge or you're not using the portable monitor? We know that these machines are being used 365 days a year. So that would be like having somebody come over to your house and test for carbon monoxide and say, "Looks like you're good. You're getting zeros. You don't need to monitor. I'll be back in a year." Right? That's crazy. We wouldn't do that. And so it's the same principle with continuous monitoring, which Amy recommends through their ST58 update. Um, and so that's the type of monitor that you can put right next to or on top of your machine that's going to give you three key numbers. right? The real-time instantaneous value in parts per million, what's in the air right now in this spot, the 15-minute time weighted average, and the 8-hour time weighted average, because there's set thresholds for each of those areas. And so, those are really the options for folks. Of course, we recommend continuous monitoring because of the reasons that I just talked about. And when you do that, then you're able to actually, Adam, to your point, then you're able to actually make changes in your department to minimize that exposure. For example, let's say you run a VHP cycle and you crack the door, and if you have a real-time continuous monitor, you might see a little bit of a spike. It might go up to 1 part per million or 2 parts per million or more. You can take a step back. You can go do something else in the department, wait till the monitor says 0, and then you're safely able to reach into the machine and pull out the tray. So that's a very practical way to leverage that to keep your team safe.
I love the practical side of things like that because one of the things is, Alex, you might already know this, but I was a user of a ChemDAQ
Mhm.
monitoring system when I worked in the hospital. Now this one was for ethylene oxide. We hadn't. I don't even know if you guys had at that time the hydrogen peroxide one yet.
Mhm.
Maybe you did, and I just didn't know it. But we were using it for ethylene oxide, and of course, you get these questions like, why is the alarm going off or whatever, and different things from a practical standpoint. And that's ultimately what we need to get our listeners is what do we do with this thing? What is it really telling us? And how can we use it on a day-to-day basis? I love this one because like you said, almost every department today is going to have some sort of uh, vaporized hydrogen peroxide machine. They just have
Right.
to have it these days. So this is one where, with an odorless gas that you never know what the concentration is. It's
Right.
this is the way, man. This is the way to do it. The real time monitoring as a manager, that's what you want to know so that you can take those practical steps in your department. Like you said, if there's a little bolus into the air every time you open the door, I mean, shoot, I never thought about that, but that makes perfect sense to me, especially since uh, in as far as I know, vaporized hydrogen peroxide is different than ethylene oxide in a sense because ethylene oxide had to have an abater that
Yes.
would get rid of your gas or off gas. Yes, it took forever, but it was off gassing outside of the hospital. Whereas vaporized hydrogen peroxide, it's just a box. Like, where's this stuff going, right? So we have to have those practical steps to keep our people safe. And it's like, if you don't see it or smell it or whatever, it's very easy to kind of ignore. So I appreciate you explaining all of that, especially the practical steps. And Alex, I wanted to give you a chance here to give us any other final thoughts that you might have. This is a very important topic, and just want to make sure that we touch all the bases on this.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin, and well said in that summary. I would just say that for your listeners, uh, be a champion for safety in your department.
Mm.
This is something we talk about a lot too. It's one thing to sell monitoring systems, right? That's all well and good. It's another thing to instill a culture of safety in the department. And that's really what I care about. That's really what we care about at ChemDAQ. I know that's what Healthmark cares about. And so be a champion for safety in your department. Ask these questions, right? Hey, when's the last time we did chemical vapor monitoring in our department? Is this something that we should take a look at when you go into, if you're listening to this in the car or when you're working out or something like that? When you go into your next team huddle, tomorrow morning, ask the question. Raise this with your team. Make sure that it's something that's talked about and part of the daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly training,
Mm.
right? I think that's the most important thing. I think if folks don't get anything else out of this, I would hope that they get that chemical safety is important, and at a minimum, we need to be having conversations about it on a regular basis.
Perfect.
Yeah, great information. Thank you, Alex Hilliker, for joining us on the podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next one.